We need to move quickly. I have got eyes on the perimeter.
A man who fixes other people's broken buildings doesn't belong here. Is that really what you think of me? Get out. Her mother tossed my bag onto the gravel without a word. Colton Reese slid into my seat and smiled like he'd already won something. I watched their SUV roll toward the security booth. The guard scanned the guest list. No results. Mallory pointed back at me. The gate opened, but not for her. The screen flashed 4 words. Spencer Lockhalden, sole family heir. Every guard and every camera in that driveway went completely still. My wife had just thrown the owner of this estate out of her car. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now before this story goes any further, because what happens next inside those gates is something you'll want to see through to the end. I've been restoring other people's history for 15 years. Libraries with cracked limestone columns, churches with rotting bell towers, courthouses whose fronts had been slowly eaten by a century of weather. These were the places I spent most of my waking hours cleaning and rebuilding what others had written off as too far gone. My colleagues called it noble work. Mallory, in the last year of our marriage, called it a hobby that paid poorly. She wasn't always like that. I want to be honest about that because it's easy, too easy, to look back at a marriage that ended in a gravel driveway and decide the whole thing was a mistake from the beginning. It wasn't. 6 years ago, the night Mallory's father was rushed to the hospital after a heart attack, I drove 3 hours in the rain without calling ahead. She didn't ask me to come. I just went. I sat beside her in that waiting room until 4 in the morning, not saying much, not doing anything heroic, just being there. She told me later that was the moment she knew she wanted to marry me. Not because I was impressive, because I showed up. The man she married lived in a rented house in the Richmond suburbs, drove a 12-year-old pickup truck, and thought a good Saturday meant spending the afternoon rewiring old walls in a building most people had already forgotten existed. I wasn't embarrassed by any of it. I was good at what I did and the work felt like it mattered. But somewhere between our 2nd and 3rd anniversary, I noticed Mallory had started answering the question, "What does your husband do?" with a tight smile and a subject change. She wasn't lying. She just stopped sharing the truth. The change in her didn't happen overnight. It came in layers the way damage comes to an old building, slowly enough that you almost miss it until the structure starts to shift. Her friends were buying second homes. Her colleagues were getting mentioned in trade magazines. Her mother, Denise, had a special gift for calling at exactly the right moment to mention what some other woman's husband had just purchased or achieved. Mallory didn't become someone different. She became someone worn out by the distance between the life she had and the life she'd started to believe she deserved. I watched it happen and told myself it was a phase. I was wrong about that. What Mallory never knew, what almost no one knew, was that my last name wasn't the whole truth of who I was. I was born Spencer Halden. When I was 8 years old, 2 men tried to take me from my school parking lot. They were caught before they got far, but my father never forgot it. That same week, he made a decision. I would carry my mother's surname, Locke, from that point forward. I would not appear in any public records connected to the Halden family, and I would be raised to understand the value of a life built by your own hands rather than handed down by chance of birth. My mother passed when I was 11, and the name she had given me became the only thing of hers I carried into adulthood. Theodore Halden was not a man who appeared on magazine covers or gave interviews to money reporters. He built Halden Dominion from a small rail freight operation into a privately held group of companies spanning clean energy, shipping, satellite systems, data systems, and water technology almost entirely out of the public eye. The company's true value had never been formally published. Most people in the financial world knew the name but not the number. The number was over $1.1 trillion. He told me more than once, sitting in the study at Alderwick House, that the only people worth trusting were the ones who showed up before they knew what you were worth. I visited in secret a few times a year. My father and I would walk the trails through the property's backwoods or sit arguing about the right and wrong of large-scale building or the right way to set up a charity fund. I never brought Mallory. Not because I didn't want her to know the truth. I'd thought about telling her dozens of times, but because every time I came close to the conversation something would happen that made me pull back. A dinner party where she laughed too loudly at a joke made at the expense of someone who couldn't afford to be in the room. A comment about a colleague's husband who'd apparently wasted his potential going into public school teaching. Small things. Individually forgivable. Together they formed a pattern I didn't know how to trust. I kept waiting for the version of Mallory who'd sat with me in that hospital waiting room to come back. I think I was still waiting when she met Colton Reese. She told me it started at a networking event. A new work contact who ran a mid-size investment fund and was charming in the way that men who've spent years practicing charm tend to be. Colton began taking her to dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices. He sent gifts, not flashy ones, but well-chosen ones, the kind that signal someone has been paying very close attention to you. He told her she was operating below her level. He made her feel in a very short period of time like the main problem in her life had a name and that name was Spencer. What Mallory didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Colton had identified her before they ever met. His fund had been circling a clean energy part of Halden Dominion for 2 years making quiet questions that were quietly turned away each time. His research team had checked every work contact near Halden's inner network and Mallory's communications firm had handled a small contract for a company that shared an industry meeting with one of Halden's parts. Her name appeared on the edge of a very long list. That was enough for Colton to decide she was worth chasing, not because he knew the full size of my connection to the family, but because any thread leading toward Alderwick was a thread worth pulling. He set up the introduction. Everything after that was planned. My father found out. I didn't know this at the time, but Theodore's internal security team had flagged Colton Reese months before Mallory ever mentioned his name to me. When his analysts connected Mallory to the situation, my father didn't call me. Instead, he asked Cecilia Frost, his longtime legal director, to document everything and store it on an offline drive. He told her that if something happened to him before the situation resolved itself, she would know what to do with the material. He didn't want me reacting from anger. He wanted me to see the truth clearly with everything I needed already in hand. That was how my father operated. He didn't warn you a storm was coming. He quietly made sure you already had shelter before it arrived. I didn't know any of that when Cecilia called me on a Tuesday morning in October to say my father had suffered a stroke at Alderwick House and hadn't survived it. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a church I was supposed to be inspecting that day and didn't move for a long time. Whatever mixed grief I'd been quietly carrying for years, the loneliness of loving a father I couldn't publicly claim, collapsed in on itself all at once. Mallory came home to find me at the kitchen table. I told her I'd lost someone important and that I needed to attend a private memorial service at a property called Alderwick House in Ravenport, Virginia. She asked if she could come. I should have said no, but I was grieving and not thinking clearly, and some part of me that still wanted to believe in the marriage said yes. She didn't ask who had died. She asked what the guest list would look like. The morning of the service Mallory hired an SUV. She was dressed in black that read more like fashion than mourning. Her mother, Denise, sat in the back seat with the settled confidence of someone who had already decided this day was an opportunity. Colton sat beside her, jacket pressed, expression calm. I rode in the passenger seat and watched the Virginia hills pass and thought about the last phone call I'd had with my father 3 weeks earlier. Ordinary talk about a drainage project on the eastern edge of the property. I hadn't known it would be the last one. No one in that car asked how I was doing. Mallory and Colton talked in low voices about the people they planned to approach at the service. Denise made a comment about the property being well maintained as though she were a buyer checking its resale value. I said nothing. I watched the iron gates of Alderwick appear at the end of the long approach road and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the people sitting behind me. Then Mallory stopped the car. She turned to me with the expression I'd come to recognize in the last year of our marriage, calm on the surface, something harder underneath, and told me she needed me to switch seats with Colton. She wanted them to enter together. When I didn't move, she opened the passenger door, looked at me directly, and said, "A man who fixes other people's broken buildings doesn't belong walking through that gate. Get out." Her mother dropped my bag onto the gravel. Colton stepped out, walked around the front of the car, and settled into the seat I had been removed from without looking at me once. Mallory said the marriage was over, her voice flat and final, "The way you close an account you've decided costs more than it returns." Then she drove the SUV forward toward the security booth. I stood in the driveway with my bag at my feet. The guard scanned his tablet. He looked up. He scanned again. Then he stepped back from the booth, and the main gate swung open, not for Mallory, but away from her. Bernard Quinn came through first, the way Bernard always moved with unhurried certainty, followed by 6 members of the household staff. He stopped in front of me, straightened slightly, and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Spencer." Behind him, the identification screen mounted to the gatehouse wall displayed 4 words in plain white text. Spencer Lockhalden, sole family heir. Mallory was still in the driver's seat. I could see her face in the rearview mirror, the expression of someone who has just realized the ground they were standing on was never ground at all. I picked up my bag. Bernard fell into step beside me and we walked through the gate together without a word. There was nothing that needed to be said. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now so you don't miss what comes next. Bernard didn't take me through the main entrance. He led me around the east wing through the side corridor that my father had always preferred, the one lined with framed building drawings of Alderwick's original construction dating back to the early 1900s. I used to walk this hallway as a child and wonder what kind of man orders a building like this. By the time I was old enough to understand, I'd already decided I didn't want to be that kind of man. My father, to his credit, never tried to talk me into otherwise. The house was full of people I half recognized, faces from my father's work world, board members, legal people, a few politicians whose names I knew from news coverage but had never met in person. They moved through the rooms with the careful restraint of people who understood something important was happening and were putting on their best version of seriousness. I moved through them without speaking. No one in that crowd knew who I was. That had always been the arrangement. Cecilia Frost met me in the hallway outside my father's private study. She was a slim woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades managing huge results without raising her voice. She'd been with my father for over 20 years. If anyone understood what Theodore Halden had built and what it had cost him, it was Cecilia. She put her hand briefly on my arm, said she was sorry, and then said, "He left instructions. Before anything else today, you need to come inside." The study was exactly as I remembered it. The wide oak desk, the wall of books that were actually read rather than shown off, the brass clock on the mantelpiece that my father wound by hand every evening. Cecilia set a wooden box on the desk in front of me. Inside were 3 items, a handwritten letter, a small offline drive, and a playback device. She explained that my father had asked her to brief me on the practical contents of the letter before I read it in full, the key business instructions, the board contacts, the legal framework. She went through them carefully. Then she placed the box in front of me and said, "The rest is his in his own words. Take whatever time you need." I connected the drive and pressed play. My father appeared on the small screen seated in this same chair in this same room. He looked older than I'd expected, thinner too, in a way I hadn't noticed during our last phone call. He spoke without build-up, the way he always did, as though he'd already said the opening version of this speech in his head and was moving directly to the part that mattered. He said, "I've known about Colton Reese for longer than you have. Our security team flagged him when his fund started making quiet questions about the clean energy division. This was more than a year ago. When your wife's name appeared in the same report, I asked Cecilia to document everything and keep it on the offline drive. I'm not telling you this because I wanted to test you or Mallory. I'm telling you because I couldn't protect what I built for 50 years and then leave you to defend it blind. He continued, I didn't step into your marriage. That was never my place. But I could make sure that when the truth finally surfaced, you'd have everything you needed to see it clearly and to act from a position of strength rather than shock. He looked directly at the camera before adding, the drive contains everything. Use it the way I would have used it, not to destroy people, to protect what matters. I sat in that chair for a long time after the recording ended. The grief I'd been managing since Tuesday morning shifted into something different. Something that had no clean name. My father had watched this coming. He had built me a shelter before the storm arrived and he'd done it quietly without ever making me feel managed or watched. That was the most Theodore Holden thing he could possibly have done. Cecilia gave me an hour before the reading began. The Alderwick Library held about 60 people in the setup they'd arranged, chairs in rows facing a long table where Cecilia stood with a document folder and 2 legal helpers. I found a seat near the back. Mallory had positioned herself and Colton toward the front close to the board members, which told me she'd spent her one available hour working the room rather than thinking about what she was walking into. Denise sat beside her, posture straight, expression arranged into something designed to look like dignified grief. Cecilia read the will clearly and without extra comments. My father had left me the entirety of Alderwick House and its 70 surrounding acres. He had left me 64% of the voting shares in Holden Dominion along with full control of the family's private investment networks, research funds, and real estate holdings across 19 countries. The estimated total value of the estate exceeded $1.1 trillion. There was also a specific legal clause drafted by Cecilia and signed by my father 2 years prior stating that no spouse, relative by marriage, or outside partner could access family shareholdings without a signed written okay from Spencer Locke Holden. The room took this in silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Then Mallory stood up. She crossed the room and reached for my hand. Less than 2 hours ago, she had told me our marriage was over through an open car window while her mother dropped my bag into a gravel driveway. Now, she was calling me sweetheart in front of 60 strangers and explaining to Cecilia that as my wife, she would naturally be standing by my side during this difficult time. I withdrew my hand from hers without saying anything. The room had heard the same clause I had. Colton tried a different approach. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and introduced himself to Cecilia as a financial advisor with an interest in supporting Spencer's move into the role. Cecilia looked at him the way a person looks at something they recognized some time ago and have simply been waiting to acknowledge. She said, Mr. Reese, yes, I know that name. The particular quality of her tone made several people in the room look down at their hands. I understood in that moment the full shape of what had been put together around my marriage. Colton hadn't chased Mallory because she was compelling, though she was. He hadn't stayed because he felt something for her, though he may have acted that convincingly enough to fool her. He had stayed because he believed she was a door, and he had been patient and careful and deliberate in placing himself in front of it. That realization didn't make what Mallory had done smaller, but it made it more complicated in a way I hadn't expected to feel standing in my father's library. The days that followed were not quiet. Mallory asked for a private talk that evening. She said Colton had meant nothing, that the dinners and the gifts had been work relationship building, that the pressure of living below her potential had twisted her judgment for a while. When she saw that explanation wasn't landing, she changed direction completely. She told me that I had built our marriage on a lie, that 6 years of hiding my father's identity was a basic betrayal and that she had been part of a test she'd never agreed to take. There was enough truth in that framing to make it hard to dismiss cleanly, and I think she knew that. Her mother backed every version of this argument with the special conviction of someone who had never once thought that she might be wrong. Denise told anyone who would listen that the Holden family had used Mallory as an unaware subject in some kind of social experiment and that her daughter was the real victim of the day's events. Colton meanwhile had been busy. He'd spent those same hours making calls to 3 board members who had long-standing doubts about the handover, men who had served under my father's watch and were unsure for solid work reasons about handing a trillion-dollar operation to someone whose public record consisted of church restoration projects in Central Virginia. He also reached Mallory's laptop through means that became clear later, pulled several documents from the estate's early transfer files and changed specific passages to suggest the Halden family had been watching Mallory as part of a planned campaign against her. Those changed documents reached 3 journalists the following morning. Mallory's legal team filed a court request asking for a temporary freeze on my ability to use voting rights while her claim was under review. A judge granted a limited version of the order by that afternoon. Colton moved quickly into the space that created, presenting the board with a planned sale of Halden Dominion's clean energy division to an investment group that, as Cecilia would later confirm, he controlled through a series of shell setups. 2 board members signaled they were open to the discussion. Then the footage from the Alderwick Gatehouse leaked online. The clip was 40 seconds long. Mallory opening the passenger door, the bag hitting the gravel, Colton taking my seat, the screen flashing my name. By the following morning, it had been viewed more than 40 million times. Talk shows debated whether I was a wronged husband or a calculating billionaire who'd let his wife embarrass herself for the look of it. The story had escaped every room it had started in and was now public property that no one was handling correctly. Least of all me. I went back to my father's study that night. I took the brass clock off the mantelpiece and held it for a while the way I used to watch him hold it when he was working through something hard. Then I set it down and told Cecilia, who was still at her desk in the next room, that I wasn't sure Theodore had chosen the right person. A man who spent his career rebuilding structures that other people had given up on was now supposed to run a global company group while a court order limited his power. A board ally was planning the sale of a core division. His wife was casting herself as a victim in a story the whole world was watching, and a 40-second video was being pulled apart by strangers who had never set foot in this county. I told Cecilia I was thinking about stepping back from the succession entirely. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You've heard the summary. Now read all of it, every word he wrote." She set the handwritten letter from the wooden box on the desk in front of me. Then she left the room and closed the door behind her. I opened the letter and began to read. My father's handwriting was smaller than I remembered. He'd always written in a tight, careful hand, the kind that suggested every word had been chosen before the pen touched the paper. The letter was 4 pages front and back, and I read it twice before I put it down. Most of it was practical. Instructions about specific board relationships, notes on the clean energy division's long-term structure, a list of the 3 people within the company group he trusted without question. But toward the end, there was a paragraph that had nothing to do with business. He wrote, "There will be a moment when you have everything you need to ruin them completely. The evidence will be in your hands, the platform will be yours, and the urge will feel like justice. I need you to understand that it isn't. If you use what you have to punish Mallory and Colton in front of the world, you will become exactly the man they've been describing. Cold, calculated, willing to destroy people to protect your position. That's not what I built this for. And it's not who your mother raised." He'd underlined the last sentence. I set the letter down and looked at the offline drive for a long time. Then I picked up the clock, wound it the way I'd watched my father wind it 100 times, and put it back on the mantelpiece. I went to find Cecilia. She was still at her desk. I told her I wasn't stepping back. I told her I needed to go through everything on that drive, all of it, and that I wanted the board meeting moved to the following morning. She looked at me without surprise, as though this were the conclusion she'd been waiting for me to reach on my own time. She said, "I'll make the calls." We spent the rest of that night going through the contents of the offline drive together. The documentation was thorough in the way that only a man with 20 years of company resources and a very particular concern could make it. There were communication logs, transaction records, and a series of emails between Colton and 2 board members that laid out in plain business language the structure of the planned sale and the specific conditions under which each party would benefit. There was also a complete recording from the gatehouse security system, not the 40-second clip that had circulated online, but the full sequence including the conversation between Mallory and Colton in the car before the SUV reached the booth, in which Colton outlined which executives he planned to approach at the memorial service and what he expected Mallory to help with. Her voice in that recording was different from the voice she'd used in the library the day before. She sounded like someone being led somewhere she hadn't fully chosen to go. I noted that, set it aside and focused on what the morning required. The emergency board session was held in Alderwick's formal meeting room, a long wood-paneled space my father had used for exactly this kind of purpose, with a table that seated 20 and windows that looked out over the eastern lawn. Colton arrived with the 2 board members who had signaled openness to his plan. They came in together, which told me they'd already met that morning and agreed on their approach. Colton positioned himself near the head of the table with the easy confidence of a man who has practiced the room in his head and found it favorable. He opened by speaking to the board directly. He said that the current situation, a contested succession, an active court order, and a very public scandal created conditions that were truly dangerous for the company's stability. He said that a controlled sale of the clean energy division would protect the asset's value while the leadership questions were resolved. He spoke about duty to the company. He used the word caretaking 3 times. He was very good at it. I let him finish, then I stood up. I said that before we discussed any deals, I needed the board to understand the full context of what had brought us to this room. I would start with something I should have addressed a long time ago. I had hidden the truth of my identity from my wife for the length of our marriage, and that was wrong. I wasn't asking the board to weigh in on my marriage. I was admitting it plainly because what came next required them to know I wasn't standing in front of them as someone without fault. I wanted them to hear the rest from a man who had already accounted for his own failures. Then I nodded to Cecilia. She presented the material carefully. The communication logs first, then the transaction structure, then the emails. She walked the board through the timeline, Colton's first questions into the clean energy division, the spotting of Mallory's firm as a side contact point, the documented approach to Mallory, and the parallel contact with the 2 board members currently seated at this table. She was precise and unhurried, and the room got very quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the people in them realize they have been watching something from the wrong angle. Then Cecilia played the audio. In the first recording, Colton's voice was warm and reassuring. He was telling Mallory that once the transition was complete, once they had what they needed from the company group, they could move forward together. In the second recording, made 3 days later in a call with one of his financial partners, his voice was different, efficient, final. He said Mallory had served her purpose and that he'd leave the personal arrangement as soon as the signatures were secured. He said it the way you discuss closing a position in a market you no longer need exposure to. Mallory was seated near the back of the room. She had come in with her legal representative and had been composed until that moment. I watched her face when the second recording played. She didn't react visibly. No tears. No outburst. She just went very still, the way a person goes still when something they suspected but hadn't let themselves believe has been confirmed out loud in front of witnesses. I had seen that expression on her face once before, years ago, in a different context, and the recognition of it made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel in that room, which was sorrow. Not for myself, for the version of her that had been taken apart quietly by someone who knew exactly which pieces to remove. The 2 board members who had sided with Colton did not speak for the rest of the session. The rest of the board voted to reject the planned sale, to suspend both members pending formal review, and to refer the matter, the data theft, the document changes, the coordinated manipulation of a leadership process, to the proper regulatory and investigative bodies. Cecilia presented the original unchanged succession documents, and the board voted to formally recognize my authority as Theodore Halden's sole heir and the new chair of Halden Dominion. The motion passed by a margin that left no room for doubt. Colton left the building with his legal team without speaking to anyone. He didn't look at Mallory on the way out. I asked Bernard to arrange a few minutes alone in the garden. The garden at Alderwick ran along the south face of the house, boxwood hedges, old stone paths, a fountain that my father had never once turned off during the months he was in residence, because he said the sound helped him think. I was standing near the fountain when Mallory came out through the side door and stood a few feet away. She didn't try to explain herself the way she had the night before. She said, "I knew something was wrong with him." Not at first I believed what he was showing me. But somewhere in the middle of it, I knew. And I kept going anyway, because I had already decided that whatever he was better than what I had. She looked at the fountain rather than at me. I think I told myself that for so long that I started acting it instead of feeling it. And I stopped being able to tell the difference. I thought about the hospital waiting room. I thought about the drive in the rain. I thought about how long I had watched the woman I married slowly replace herself with someone she thought the world would take more seriously, and how I had kept waiting for the original to return instead of accepting that people move in the direction of their choices, not their beginnings. I said money didn't make you cruel, Mallory. It gave you a reason to stop hiding the choices you were already making. I said it without anger because by that point the anger had been replaced by something more like clarity. I hope you figure out who you actually are when nobody's watching. I mean that. She went back inside. I did not use what I had to take anything from her beyond what was right. The divorce went forward on the terms the law required. She received what she was entitled to from our shared life, not $1 more and not $1 less. She did not receive access to the Holden estate or its holdings. Colton faced a federal investigation for securities manipulation, data theft, and coordinated fraud. The partners who had spoken warmly about him at industry events released statements distancing themselves within 72 hours. Denise discovered that the social circles she had spent years using were no longer open to her. The women she had cultivated all knew she was the one who had dropped the bag. None of them lost everything because I decided to destroy them. They lost what they had been reaching for because they had built towards something that was never real, and when the structure underneath it gave way, there was nothing left to hold. The board stabilized over the following months with a steadiness that surprised people who had expected a long power struggle. I came to every meeting prepared. I asked the questions that the reports raised rather than the questions designed to show authority. I made decisions based on documents, not the pressure of the room. 3 months in, Cecilia said across the desk, "Your father spent 10 years earning this board's trust. You did it in 90 days. I told her my father had done the harder work by making sure I understood what trust was actually for before I was ever in a position to need it. I kept the house in Richmond. I still went back on weekends, still took on restoration projects when the scope was right. Not because I needed the income or was putting on some version of humility for an audience, but because those buildings were where I had learned what I knew about the patience required to repair something the world had decided wasn't worth saving. That knowledge turned out to be more useful than I'd expected. A portion of Alderwick House was turned into a job training center, free and open to young people from low-income households, staffed by instructors paid properly because my father had always believed that education delivered on the cheap produces results worth exactly what they cost. Unused land on the eastern section of the property was developed into housing for staff families and veterans. I established the Theodore Holden Foundation for Community Preservation, funded from company earnings, dedicated to restoring schools, libraries, and water systems in towns that the larger economy had quietly left behind. One afternoon in late spring, I was standing at the gate, the same spot where my bag had hit the gravel, when Bernard came to walk with me up to the house. He asked, the way he occasionally asked things he already knew the answer to, whether I'd thought about replacing the old gatehouse, whether a new entrance might suit the property better given everything that had happened there. I told him no. The gate stayed exactly where it was. We walked up the drive together in the quiet that Alderwick carried in late afternoon, when the light came low through the tree line and the fountain was the only sound. At the front door, I looked up at the window of the study on the second floor, at the room where my father had sat in that chair and recorded a message for a son he trusted to eventually find his footing, and I said quietly, I didn't hold on to what you built by destroying them. I held on to it by not becoming them. The door opened. I went inside. And maybe that's the thing worth sitting with. Not the gate, not the number on the inheritance screen, but the question of what we're actually building toward in the relationships we choose. Spencer didn't lose his marriage the day Mallory told him to get out of the car. He lost it slowly across 6 years of quiet moments when respect started to disappear and neither of them said anything. Money didn't create that damage. It just made it impossible to ignore any longer. The most powerful thing Spencer did wasn't exposing Colton in that boardroom. It was walking out of it without becoming the kind of man who needed to. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.